Hi everyone, I am reading In Other Words, Boothbay Harbor, Series Book 1 by Pamela Q. Fernandes, presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. Trish Holt was about 6 years old when her father happily announced two things. She'd got a new baby brother, and she'd finally become an American citizen. More specifically, she was now an official member of the Holt family. Her new name, Trish, would be permanent forever, and for the rest of her life she would be reminded how grateful she should be for the privileged life other Korean orphans could only hope for. It was all chance, he said, and she was so fortunate to have been given one. The weight of those announcements didn't make Trish any different from the usual quiet child she had become. It turned her into quite the opposite. She'd become even more isolated, closed. The declaration that she was somehow different made it difficult in this harborside town along the New England coast. It was something out of her hands. As a child of 6, she'd come to understand that being different wasn't necessarily a good thing, and when you don't want to fight anymore, you simply join them, and she tried to blend in without highlighting her differences. She just wanted to fit in. The problem was, if you have blonde-haired parents with translucent skin and blue eyes, while you have small-winged eyes, dark hair, and yellow skin, you already stand out. And she didn't know real parents and kids had matching hair and eyes until a classmate in school told her so. That's when she knew she was different. She never felt the distinction at home, but she knew some of it had started when her mother had gone to the hospital. When she woke up beside her mother that day, her mother kissed her and shrieked on seeing the river of red on the sheet. It was a stream she'd never forget in her life. As soon as her father heard, he dashed into the room and called the doctor on the phone. Trish was quite alarmed at the panic in their 6-bedroom brick home. She sat in the blood-soaked bed in her pajamas with her hands covering her ears as her mother's breathing quickened. She watched her father rush down the stairs so fast she could hear the air whip past. "Get your slippers and your favorite dress. Hurry!" Her father's usual calm evaporated and his face turned white. "What's going on? Is Mommy going to die?" Her father's face snapped to her, his eyes so round and forbidding that she was afraid he would slap her like some of the caretakers did at the orphanage. "Do not ever say something like that ever again. I'm taking your Mommy to the hospital." "I'm going to?" "No. You'll have to stay with Miss Simpson." "Can't I go to Uncle Ben's house?" "Not now, Trish. Hurry up with your things." "No, don't bother. You can change at Miss Simpson's place. Geez, look at you." Trish didn't know what to make of this, but in her childlike mind she thought her father hated her at that moment. Somehow her mother climbed into the back of the car, her legs all bloody and wet. Her father walked her off to the neighbor's home. Before she could even turn, her father was already in the car seat, and without as much as a backward glance, the car screeched down the road. Miss Simpson's home was very old, just like her. The woman barely smiled when she told Trish to sit in the corner like a good girl and not move at all. Trish didn't want to move either because the house had that strange old people smell. There was a funny-looking bronze horn in the corner. From that horn emerged music notes, rising and falling. It was a magical sound. So Trish craned her neck a little, but the music didn't come from here. Trish slid off the old worn-out paisley couch and drifted in search of it until she reached a door that was slightly ajar. Miss Simpson sat at a giant piano, and the music came from her fingers. Beautiful melodies that made all the panic disappear. It gave her a feeling she couldn't explain. Trish smiled. She'd never heard such music before. Every note made her feel alive and free. Miss Simpson suddenly stopped. "I thought I told you to stay put," she said in a stern voice. But it's nothing like I've ever heard," Trish said, and pushed the door open. She saw the whole piano, and her eyes widened like an owl. The black shine of the piece and the sounds that came from it amazed her. "Did it really come from here?" she asked with wonder in her voice, awed by the instrument. Trish tilted her head one way and then the other. Miss Simpson laughed. "Of course it did, silly. Do you like it?" Trish sat on the floor and crossed her legs. "I love it. I'll stay very still, Miss Simpson. You can make music," she said in a hushed voice. Miss Simpson seemed pleased with her reverence. "All right. I'll play something special for you. Maybe some old jazz. Have you heard of Frank Sinatra? Trish shook her head, mesmerized by the piano and the woman asking her some very serious questions. For the first time in her life, Frank Sinatra must be someone really important. He sounded important. Miss Simpson sighed. Of course you haven't. Your parents don't seem to be the kind of people who enjoy tasteful music. This one's called Fly Me to the Moon. Trish would never forget that song for the rest of her life. It became her anthem. She listened to it and clapped vigorously when the song was over. Miss Simpson was happy to do an encore, but by the end of it was tired. You've worn me out. That's why I never had any kids of my own. Trish learned from guests arriving home that her mommy had a C-section and their brother had been very sick. He spent a week in the hospital in a special room before they could allow him to come home. Flynn was a sick child and would need a lot of care. That meant Trish had to be a good big sister and not upset Mommy. It also meant that Trish had to be unseen and unheard in the house. "Can't you see I'm busy?" was what she commonly heard from her parents. So during the long blasted summer, instead of the usual vacation, her parents stayed home with the new baby, and she ran off to Miss Simpson. The musty-smelling woman had started giving Trish informal lessons on the piano. This was after she'd caught Trish imitating her while resting one hand on her cross-legged thigh, mouth agape at the melody that emerged from the black. She also learned to stay away from Flynn. The slightest noise from him resulted in a timeout or a scolding. It turned her brother into a vortex, and she stayed on the fringe to avoid falling in. Within months, Flynn grew bigger, and his room was filled with stuffed toys and new clothes. He was allowed anything and everything while the rules were strictly applied to her. And then with time, Trish saw the differences play out more clearly. Growing up with a sibling had its pitfalls, especially for an adopted child. Flynn always had a big birthday, and his wish was their parents' command. The Holts lived in the Durham neighborhood of New Hampshire, originally populated by Irishmen and Scots, who had fled blight and terror to develop the fishing and currying industries. Today, the Irish heritage still lingered as Durham morphed into a quaint seaside town with Irish pubs and weekend football. Trish's mother cooked what her own Irish mother had taught her: soda bread, beef stew with Guinness, Dublin caudle with rich creamy potatoes, cabbage pies, succulent chicken dumplings, tasty shepherd's pie, and brat filled with nuts and fruits soaked in overnight whiskey. Trish learned to be an Irish cook. She loved to help her mother because it gave her a sense of closeness to her, a space where Flynn wouldn't encroach, a sacred space. As the summers faded and new winters emerged on the horizon, the situation at home grew testier. Flynn was granted privileges she never enjoyed, and when Trish complained about the differences, she was made to feel like an outsider, someone who had no right to do so, given that she was blessed with an opportunity to simply be here. That seemed to be the underlying principle. "How can you complain after everything we've done for you? You're a very lucky child. Any other child in your place would have been happy instead of being jealous of their own brother." But he was not her own, and that had been drilled into her mind time and again. Ridden with guilt for days, Trish would find herself more driven to her music. Miss Simpson had allowed her to come on special days to learn, and even gave her a practice book for music theory. She'd not known why the feelings toward her from the inside, but she was jealous. Jealous of singular attention focused on Flynn. His antics drove her crazy, and she didn't know how to make it better. But it forced her to compete. No one questioned why Trish started wearing only trousers and shirts, or why she asked for her beautiful glossy mane to be cut short. She got involved in baseball and did everything she could to compete with Flynn as the years passed by. And it wasn't as if Trish was consumed with hatred. She'd worshipped her mother despite it all. Enamored with her mother's soft gold locks and her flawless skin, she'd often felt incredibly lucky to have such a beautiful mother. When her classmates often pointed out that her mother had blue eyes, Trish felt proud of her mom. She didn't mind shouting at her classmates, "Yes, that's my mother." In the meantime, she could only hope that things would one day even out between her brother and her. While it was always said that the Holts loved both their children equally, she knew in her heart that wasn't true. Some late evenings, Trish would drag her teddy out of bed and join her mother on the couch while she watched a late-night movie. She would burrow into her mother's side and fall asleep there in her rose scent. She was faintly aware of her father picking her up and putting her back into bed. Tears laced her eyes, and as soon as Trish was placed on her bed, she let them wet her pillow. Her mother would still do her hair and buy her new girly clothes, and it made her happy to see her mother enjoy her girliness. She often color matched her, and those were the happiest days of her childhood. It wasn't always smooth sailing, though. If Trish had played with her mother's lipstick or got a B instead of an A, then her mother would be indifferent and aloof. She'd serve her meals without a word or leave her at home when they went out as punishment. It confused Trish. She didn't understand how she could earn more love at home. Slowly, she morphed into a lad, and yet her parents seemed perpetually unhappy with her. Nothing made them as happy as when Flynn sang a song or kicked a ball. Flynn never won a prize, but everything he did was celebrated grandly. Flynn was indulged in everything. Every time he cried or demanded something, they were quick to provide it. And so it continued for years. One particular evening, the Holts decided to accept a dinner invitation to a fancy gala. They'd arranged Miss Simpson to babysit the kids, except when the mousy woman arrived, Flynn, who'd turned 4, threw a tantrum that had him breathless and red in the face. To appease him, they promptly carried him to the car and left behind Trish with the woman, who took her back to her house. Trish didn't know the feeling coursing through her. All she knew was that she was an outsider, someone disposable, someone temporary, and with every year that passed by, she knew she would outserve her purpose. When her parents picked her up later that night, she smiled wide when she saw them. She was half afraid through the evening that they might never come back for her. Of late, that feeling of being sent away again had taken possession of her mind. "Did Miss Simpson give you a snack?" "No," she told her father. "Didn't you leave instructions for Miss Simpson?" her father said rather forcefully as he went to the cupboard and fished out the cereal. "She wasn't supposed to be at her place. I wanted her to babysit here. That's no excuse for her starving. We should have brought her something," he said as his eyes zeroed in on Flynn running around with the kiddie meal toy. Trish didn't stare at the toy. She was too old to ask for something like that. She knew better. As soon as the bowl was placed before her, she started eating her cereal and milk. In her heart somewhere, heart wedged upwards, but she was grateful. She reminded herself, lots of children in the orphanages don't have a bed, nice clothes, and a lovely home like her. She got to go to school and play the piano, something she'd been doing very often now for 4 years. "She's not that little," her mother said. "Just leave her be." The bias struck her deep in her soul. Trish quietly munched her cereal, hoping to hear a rejoinder from her father. It never came. "I think we had a good night," her mother said, as if Trish wasn't even in the room. Her father didn't reply. He just waited for Trish to finish her cereal. Mechanically, he washed her bowl and spoon and walked out of the room. A few days later, Trish dreaded handing the circular her Sunday school teacher gave her mother as she picked her up from school. "It's for you." "What is it now? Can't it wait, Trish?" Cindy Holt had one hand on the steering wheel and another wrapped around a styrofoam cup of coffee. Trish waited and bit her lip, her mother busy maneuvering her way out of the rotunda. Parents were all in a haste to zip their way home. Impatiently, her mother sighed. "Why don't you tell me instead, darling?" The smile from Trish's lips came unbidden. "I need a costume for the talent show." Cindy only spoke when they stopped at the traffic light. After a quick glance at the road, she took the paper from her hand and read it. 3 weeks to get you ready in a costume? Is this compulsory?" Trish shook her head. "Miss Pippin says everyone has to have some talent." She so wanted to participate, and the talent show didn't cost any money. As far as her costume was concerned, she could wear her usual clothes. It was no big deal. She had it all figured out. Her mother closed her eyes and pressed the bridge of her nose. "I don't have the energy to deal with this. Why do they always do this and spring things on parents at the last minute? As if we don't have enough to do with all the normal homework." Trish covered her mother's hand with her own, small one. "You don't have to train me. I'll get ready all by myself. But somebody will have to buy you clothes and practice whatever it is you plan to do." She pressed the call button to her husband. Her father picked up on the 3rd ring. He sounded worn out and seemed distracted. Oliver Holt was so busy making the big bucks as an executive for a hotel chain that it wasn't a wonder they ever saw him. He'd often return long after the children slept and awoke up after they'd gone to school. Even while he was at home, he was always glued to his computer dealing with emergency issues at the hotel. Trish couldn't remember the last time he'd asked her about her friends' names, favorite food, or even which grade she was in. So it came as a shock to her when her mother said, "You'll need to train Trish for her talent show." Thanks.